Hello everyone and welcome to this evening's Poetry Karaoke. My name's Craig Savage. I'm the Deputy Director of the Bristol Poetry Institute, and a big welcome to you all from the Bristol Poetry Institute, from Residential Life and from the University of Bristol. Also a very happy and warm National Poetry Day to you all. We're very pleased you can join us here on National Poetry Day to celebrate poetry, but also to take part in the reading of poetry, in the words themselves. Today's event, as I say, is Poetry Karaoke. For those of you who are new to this type of event, it works exactly like ordinary karaoke, except instead of singing, when it's your turn, you would recite a poem. What will happen this evening is I will draw audience members out of the audience and add them to the panel when it becomes their turn to read. I will ask readers to briefly introduce themselves and their choice of poem before then asking them to read the poem itself. Once a person has finished their reading, I'll return them to the audience while the panel comments and I call up the next reader. Those audience members who'll be reading this evening have applied in advance to do so. In order to give those readers some notice of when they are to read, I'll remember to say who's next when calling the first reader to the virtual stage. So for example, if Elizabeth Barrett Browning were here to read the first poem, I'd say, we have Elizabeth Barrett Browning here to read her poem. Next up, we'll have Robert Browning. I'll also do my best to pronounce everyone's names right, but do forgive me if I get them wrong. After each reading, we'll have a response from our panel, as I say, and I will manage the technology to move someone from audience to panel. If I could ask that those readers move to the panel, keep their microphones muted until they're asked to introduce themselves. And then if the readers could remember to turn off their cameras and microphones once they've read their poem and are waiting to be returned to the audience. We're excited to have a few international poems with an international flavour that will be read in their native tongues. And could those readers just allow a little more time for their poems to be displayed in English on the screen for the audience to read whilst the recital is made. In the event of my screen freezing or my internet dropping out, or if we're kicked out of Zoom, I will attempt to restart the webinar as soon as possible, and do please try to log back in. But if I'm not able to restart, I will confirm this to you by email. So if my panel members would like to turn on their microphones and their images, their camera images, I'd like to introduce them. First, we have Mike.
Good evening. Do you want more of an introduction, Craig?
If you would, Mike.
Indeed, I would, yeah. So my name is Mike Bettles. I work at the moment as a residential life advisor at Bristol Uni, along with Craig. I'm also education trustee for the Anne Frank Trust. Before that, I was in secondary education and taught English as part of that for over 30 years.
Thanks, Mike. If we can go to Becca next.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Hutchin. I used to work at Bristol, which is where I did my PhD. Now I work at Lancaster University. I've been there now for 3 years on a digital mapping project. But I still have strong links with Bristol and work with Ralph Pite on a mobile phone app called Romantic Bristol, which geolocates poetry in the city and allows you to explore the kind of romantic history of Bristol via your smartphone.
Thanks, Rebecca, and maybe we'll get you to say a bit more about that at the end. And finally, Reza.
Good evening, I'm Reza Tahir Kirmani. I'm talking to you from Toronto, Canada. I lived and I did my PhD in Bristol almost 6 years ago. Since then, I've been working in different places. I was in Singapore, I was in Iran, I was in Kazakhstan, teaching comparative literature and poetry, British poetry, and I'm in Toronto now working on my second book.
Thanks, Reza. And as I say, I'm Craig Savage. I'm Deputy Director of the Bristol Poetry Institute and Senior Associate Teacher in the English Department. Okay, so let's start proceedings. Clive James, in his final bit of writing, The Fire of Joy, reminds us that the Italians have a word for the store of poems or shards of poetry we carry around in our head. This word is gasofalatio, meaning a treasure chamber of the mind. So we hope tonight to add to that treasure chamber for you, beginning with Rebecca and then followed by Alessio. So that's followed by Alessio. So Rebecca, if you wouldn't mind introducing your poem and reading when ready.
Sure. So the poem that I've chosen is a poem by Mary Robinson about Thomas Chesterton. The reason that I've chosen this poem is because this year, 2020, marks 250 years since Chesterton died. It also marks 220 years since Robinson died. They both were born in Bristol. So we've got two Bristol-born poets, both with a significant anniversary this year. It's quite long, so I'm just going to launch straight into reading it. And also I wouldn't want to preempt anything that anyone wants to say about the poem beforehand. So I'll just crack into reading it. I'll just say that I'm not reading the whole thing because it's quite a long poem. So I'm starting about a quarter of the way through and I'm finishing about a quarter from the end. Hard was thy lot, from every comfort torn, in poverty's cold arms condemned to mourn, to live by mental toil, even when the brain could scarce its trembling faculties sustain, to mark the dreary minutes slowly creep, each day to labour and each night to weep. Immured in shades, from busy scenes removed, no sound to solace, but the verse he loved. No soothing numbers harmonised his ear, no feeling bosom gave his griefs a tear. Obscurely born, no generous friends he found to lead his trembling steps over classic ground. No patron filled his heart with flattering hope, no tutored lesson gave his genius scope. Yet, while poetic ardour nerved each thought and reason sanctioned what ambition taught, he soared beyond the narrow spells that bind the slow perceptions of the vulgar mind. The fire, once kindled by the breath of fame, her restless pinions fanned the glittering flame. Warmed by its rays, he thought each vision just, for conscious virtue seldom feels distrust. With secret labour and with taste refined, this son of minstrel formed his infant mind. When opening reason earliest scenes began, the dawn of childhood marked the future man. He scorned the puerile sports of vulgar boys, his little heart aspired to nobler joys. Creative fancy winged his few short hours, while soothing hope adorned his path with flowers. Yet fame's recording hand no trophy gave, save the sad tear to decorate his grave. Yet in this dark, mysterious scene of woe, conviction's flame shall shed a radiant glow. His infant muse shall bind with nerves afire the sacrilegious hand that stabs its sire. Methinks I hear his wandering shade complain, while mournful echo lingers on the strain. Through the lone aisle his restless spirit cools, his phantom glides along the minster's walls, where many an hour his devious footsteps trod, ere fate resigned him to his pitying God.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's wonderful. Reza, if I could turn to you first for a comment.
I really like the sort of the rhyme of the poem, and I mean I think Rebecca read it fantastically well. I also think that there's just so much to the poem that you need to know to fully understand and to fully appreciate it. There's this, I'm sure Becca, you know a lot more, but I feel like there are stories within the poem, or that for you to be able to understand. And I think it was a very sort of thoughtful, full of meaning, full of thoughts poem.
Thank you, Reza. Thanks. Sure. Thanks. If we could ask Mike.
Yeah, I mean, not a poem I know, Rebecca, but I was immediately struck by the power of the language, which I thought was something that was really evident in just about every line. The other thing was, when was this written? It could have been written yesterday or today, in terms of, to me, it was about upward mobility or lack of upward mobility, and about austerity and all of these kind of things. So it had incredible resonances for the contemporary scene as well. So I thought it was a revelation to me.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, and thanks to Rebecca. So if we could now turn to Alessio. Alessio, are you ready? Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay, great, Alessio.
Sorry. Can you hear me? All right. Yeah, just a second. So my name is Alessio. I'm a PhD student in politics, and I work as chief resident in a bridal from the East Village. This evening, I'm going to read an Italian poem of the early 19th century. And the author of this poem is Giacomo Leopardi, and he's basically considered as the greatest poet of the Italian 19th century and one of the most important figures of literary romanticism. And most of his art was about a depth understanding of his existence and, of course, a wider reflection on the human condition. The poem that I'm going to read is Canto Notturno di un Pastore Errante dell'Asia, which means Night Song of a Wandering Shepherd in Asia. And in few words, the shepherd in the poem talks to the moon and wonders about his existence, actually the reason of his existence compared to the eternity of the moon. And I selected this poem because I think that the thematic explored by the poet is still topical nowadays. And I have always been drawn by this image of a simple shepherd questioning the moon in order to receive an answer about his existence, but receiving nothing more than indifference. So I'm going to read.
Thank you, Alessio.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to read the first part of this poem. Che fai tu, luna in cielo? Dimmi, che fai, silenziosa luna? Sorgi la sera e vai contemplando i deserti, in di ti posi. Ancor non sei tu paga di riandare i sempiterni calli? Ancor non prendi a schivo, ancor non sei vaga di mirar queste valli? Somiglia alla tua vita la vita del pastore. Sorge in un sul primo albore, muove la gregge oltre pel campo e vede greggi, fontane ed erbe. Poi stanco si riposa in su la sera, altro mai non ispera. Dimmi, o luna, a che vale al pastor la sua vita, la nostra vita a voi? Dimmi, ove tende questo vagar mio breve, il tuo corso immortale?
Thank you, Alessio. That was absolutely beautiful and really wonderfully read. And I hope the audience really enjoyed that. That was a real treat. If I could first go to Rebecca for this, for a response to this.
Thank you very much. That was beautiful. And how beautiful to hear it too in Italian. So a couple of things struck me. This isn't a poem that I have ever read before, nor is it a poet that I'm ashamed to say I have come across before. Firstly, there's the contrast between the subject and the language. So the language seems, certainly in its translation, quite highly poetic, but the theme perhaps is something which is celebrating simplicity. And secondly, another thing that struck me is just that the emphasis on rest and on weariness, on sleep. And it seemed echoed in the sound of the poem, that the sounds were looking towards this rest, longing for this rest.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was really insightful, I thought. Reza?
Alessio, thank you so much for sharing this really beautiful poem with us. I have two very quick thoughts. I think the first one is your really great reading of the poem says something of the power of the language, because I think you made it sound so wonderful, and there's, even when you don't understand the words, you feel like there's meaning to these words that are being read. So this says something about the whole issue of translatability or untranslatability of poetry. The other thing is I found the poem very Keatsian, actually. I thought there are Keats really like writing poems sort of addressed to natural objects, talking, contemplating on life on his sort of condition. So thank you,
Reza. Thanks, Reza. Mike, anything further?
I mean, I think we must all comment on just the beauty of the sound there, and how it's interesting that not having the sense at all of the poem, it was just beautiful to listen to. But I also thought that the sudden focus at the end on his own plight as the contrast was really just very interesting.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you. Caroline, I must apologise to you for not naming you before I brought you up. I've immediately forgot to do that. I will try and be better. Our reader following Caroline will be, or should be, Ian, although I can't see him in the guest list, in which case it will be your Liz following Caroline. So Caroline, if you'd like to introduce yourself and your poem.
Okay, my name's Caroline Burrows. I've just moved back to Bristol from Lancaster, having done an MA in creative writing at Lancaster. So Rebecca, we've probably walked past each other in the street, or been at an event at the Spotlight or something. I've got a poem I'm going to read that's about Bristol that I wrote a couple of years ago before I moved north, and it's on the Festival of Ideas website, and I've just come back because I've just completed another commission for Festival of Ideas for suicide awareness. There was a series of 4 poems for that. So this poem is a bit of social commentary about my commute when I used to cycle home past the recycling centre near St Philip's at the back of Temple Meads. I'm trying to remember all the place names. Okay, it's called Junkies in the Underpass. I cycle quickly past the junkies in the underpass. Their dealer stands dead centre, a white man dressed in black, astride a bike with no lights. This underworld his stage. Evening, brays this king of short, sharp pricks, as I ride wide of him, peddling his shit to 2 locals laid low between the broken glass and grit. His shout carries a glint, like the water in the bottle, and the tarnished metal spoon I spy left at pedal level, a scene waning like the moon. Yellow light reveals them huddled beneath the underpass's mosaics, which depict a long history of most of Bristol's trades. This current exchange excluded, and the sugar, and the slaves. Graffiti scrawls across the pictures, letters and words all strung out. Not street art, not a Banksy, just a public place defaced. It's an update representing this exact time and space. Thank you, and my picture's frozen. I'll try and sort that.
That's okay, Caroline. Thanks ever so much. If I could go to Mike first.
Yeah, thank you very much, Caroline. I really enjoyed that. To me, I immediately felt a kind of photographic quality to the poem. And I also love the way that you put in the sort of implied responses of the narrator, like I quickly cycle past. And then there were individual lines that I just really liked. In particular, King of the Short, Sharp Pricks, I thought was wonderful.
Thank you.
Sorry, if we could go to Reza next.
I felt like, Caroline, thank you so much for reading this and sharing again this beautiful poem with us. It's one of those poems that I really need to sort of read and sort of contemplate on to make it, well, not to fully understand and fully appreciate it. However, I think it's going from Alessio to you says something of the flexibility of this sort of power of poetry that allows commentaries of different kind and different time, and how we came from there to Bristol, and you both have been able to sort of really very powerfully deploy and use the power of poetry.
Thanks, Reza. And finally, Rebecca.
Thank you, Caroline. I really enjoyed that. And as a long-term Bristol resident, it really resonated with me, probably not in the most positive of ways. What I really appreciated here was the contrast that seems to be set up between the fairly standard meter and the fixed rhyme, and then the kind of the difficulty or the problematic nature of the poem's subject. And I also really liked the way that the kind of the bite of that line, and the sugar and the slaves, really haunts now the rest of the poem, and that it's sort of excluded at the end of the line, but then also dominates in retrospect. the rest of the poem and also the way that we think about Bristol. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, Rebecca. I think that comparison is really apt, isn't it? Two locals laid low between broken glass and grit. So the mosaic of Bristol's history is actually brought to bear on the underworld scene, because you have that connection between the glass and grit of a mosaic, and you have the glass and grit of the floor of the broken bottles and other detritus that lies at the feet of the junkies. A lovely connection there. Thank you, Caroline. We'll move on now to Yeliz. Yeliz, are you able to put on your camera and your microphone?
Hi, I'm Yeliz.
Oh, sorry, it looks like we've lost Yeliz there. Let me just see if we can get her back. 1 second. Here we go. Let's promote her back to panelist, and hopefully she can join us now. There we go. Sorry, Yeliz, if you could start again.
Yeah, no problem, really. Hi, I'm Yeliz. I am third year PhD student in psychology, and I'm also working for Residential Life East Village. So today I'm going to introduce an amazing Turkish poet, Nilgün Marmara. Although she had a very short life, during her life, she had to struggle with depression. However, depression didn't hold back her to produce amazing poems. So I'm just so proud of reading one of her poems today. And the poem is named as My Bird and I. And I'm going to read it in Turkish. Hope you enjoy it. Kuşum ve ben bir aynada uyuyoruz. Kafesimiz, yatağımız, yüzlerimiz eşlerine baka baka sonsuz kar altında uyuyoruz. Kuşum ve ben. Eşim ve ben kızıl bir bağla bağlıyız birbirimize. Çözülürse yoksulluk sevinir. Aynamızın içinde tek bu bağ. Kızıl kıskanç eşim, kuşum ve ben. So yeah, it's quite a short poem, but yeah.
That's okay. Thanks ever so much, Lise. That was beautiful. If I could first go to Rebecca for a response from that.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us. I really enjoyed it. I think what struck me first of all is the repetition of my bird and I, my bird and I, my mate and I. So we move from, first of all, the bird, and then the bird again being reinforced, but then the bird sort of transmutes into my mate, and you certainly get a sense of togetherness in that, and then that's suddenly interrupted with this destitution, severance, naught. So I was particularly struck, I suppose, by the contrasts of both togetherness and separation.
Thank you, Rebecca. And let me just, before we go to the next panelist, apologise to David. I should have called you up earlier. Thank you for bearing with us on that. Mike, if I can go for you for a response to Yeliz's poem.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elise. I really enjoyed reading this poem, albeit in translation, and was immediately struck by its ambiguity that I think Rebecca's kind of alluded to as well. It's at once about this, this close relationship, which yet at the same time seems to be something that's almost has a prison-like quality to it as well. But then there's a severance in there, and this, the crimson tie between us at the end seems to be something that has a lot of resonance, but I'm not quite sure where it's taking you. But all of the ambiguity, I think, is what makes it such a powerful poem.
Thanks, Mike. Great. And Reza?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for reading this poem for us. I'd like to say hello to my old professor and teacher, David. It's great to see you. But going back to the poem, I think following on the commentary that was made on the poem, to me, this is quintessentially Edward Fitzgerald-esque, if you like. So I'm just going to read a poem by a quatrain, which is quatrain 6 from the Rubaiyat, and you could see the sort of resemblances that exist in imagery, in the symbolism, and this is also a sort of love poem, a love stanza. I'll be very quick. So it goes, and David's lips are locked, but in divine, high piping Pahlavi with wine, 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 red wine. The nightingale cries to the rose, that yellow cheek of hers to incarnadine. So you have this image of a rose and a nightingale who is in love with the rose, and then the image of red wine and the passion of love and the sort of the yellowness that because of the sort of this sort of reaction that the rose shows, and then she blushes, she goes red because of knowing that the nightingale is in love with her. So that would be
Thank you. Thanks, Reza. Sorry to cut across you there. Time is against us. So if I can now ask David to introduce himself and his poem, and the following reader after David will be Mike Bettle. So David, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you, Craig. Okay, my poem is called Making a Day of It. And I wrote it obviously under conditions of lockdown, and thinking of what we can make of this, these appalling restrictions on our lives. Making a day of it. A snatch of Harry Belafonte on the radio, singing Mary's Boy Child, though it isn't Christmas. A small girl in the park, picking up a hazel twig, stopping, ambushed in a green hush as she whips it. 2 robins on the lawn, prancing, preening, indignity outside my bee-bombarded study window. My granddaughter feeding swans by the lake, while they produce a glare she will later perceive as malevolent. High, fading contrails, producing for a poised moment a perfect letter X, immediately erased. A solicitor's sign advertising wills, bequests, debt advice. Furtive movement behind the smoked panes. Somewhere else, the unheard roar of oceans, the slow smashing of tectonic plates, lava flow. What is it, this gift of sewing fragments together to make a multicolored, imperfect day?
Thank you so much for that powerful reading, David. If I could ask Mike to comment first.
Thanks, David. I really enjoyed that. I loved it in the poem as a whole, the series of images that, and it was interesting what you were saying about lockdown, because I was thinking of that, not knowing that that's what you were actually referring to. Because sometimes days were like that, weren't they? Where it just felt like they were a kind of a series of images and a kind of dislocated way of thinking about things. So I really enjoyed that. I want to pick up on the phrase "be bombarded" as well, because that's something else that struck me about lockdown, which was how it wasn't lockdown for nature, it was kind of a release for nature. And in many ways, nature woke up at that time that we sort of disappeared from the scene. And finally, what really struck me was the contrast between some of the images, like the solicitor's sign, to the enormous universality of the smashing of tectonic plates, which put it in a very different context. So thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And Teresa?
David, thank you so much. It was wonderful. I'm going to make a fairly far-fetched analogy. The poem reminds me of this, somehow reminded me of this letter that Matthew Arnold wrote to his sister, telling her that do not try to make sense of me. These fragments of me that you see, this is me. And this is a poem that in a way sort of embodies that these, and you use the word fragments, and these images that are, and these experiences that are sort of scattered, and you try to put them together to make this, to make an imperfect, as you call it, imperfect day. So I found it wonderful and very sort of like, you need to follow these images, and it
thanks, Rez.
Yes,
Thanks, Rez. That's great. Thank you, Reza. Thank you. Sorry, Rebecca, please.
Thank you, David. I'll just echo everyone was saying how wonderful that was. I think what I immediately thought of is that moment just before you fall to sleep, and various bits of your day kind of flash before you in completely unconnected places, completely unconnected sections of your day, both in terms of what you've seen, but also in terms of what you've felt. And I was also struck by the sensuousness of it. So it isn't just imagery in terms of sight, but also in terms of sound and in terms of that kind of tactile sense of the day as you kind of piece it together, though it might not fit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks ever so much. We're going to go to Mike Bettles next to read his poem.
Thank you. Yes, so this is a poem called Long Distance 2 by Tony Harrison. Tony Harrison is a poet who I admire greatly, both for his poetry about his father, but also for the poetry that he did as sort of television pieces as well. In particular, I've always found one called The Gaze of the Gorgon incredibly powerful. Anyway, this is one about his relationship with his father, his relationship with death, and various other things. Though my mother was already 2 years dead, Dad kept her slippers warming by the gas, put hot water bottles her side of the bed, and still went to renew her transport pass. You couldn't just drop in, you had to phone. He'd put you off an hour to give him time to clear away her things and look alone, as though his still raw love was such a crime. He couldn't risk my blight of disbelief, though sure that very soon he'd hear her key scrape in the rusted lock and end his grief. He knew she'd just popped out to get the tea. I believe life ends with death, and that is all. You haven't both gone shopping. Just the same, in my new black leather phone book, there's your name and the disconnected number I still call.
Thanks ever so much, Mike. That was a wonderful reading of the Tony Harrison there. I particularly like the turn of the final verse in this poem that moves away from a certain judgment towards the father and to a recognition of the pain and the love that is continuing to be felt by the father. I particularly like the idea that the poet turns back on himself and on the writing of poetry, how even though he believes that life ends in death, just the same in my new black leather phone book, there's your name and the disconnected number I still call. As though the poet, in writing a collection of poetry, the poetry becomes the phone book and the phone book becomes a collection of poetry, the leather-bound book. If we can go to Rebecca next.
Yeah, and also just to add to that, I suppose that the narrator, the speaker of the poem, then kind of becomes the father and realizes that that's grief. It reminded me a lot of Hardy's elegies, that kind of celebration or remembrance of the everyday, which may seem mundane, but is actually the most powerful because it's the most familiar. And also just to briefly mention about the first stanza, really, that I was struck by the way that it's very framed by death. So you have dead at the beginning of the first line, and then you have pass at the end of the last line, and death kind of sneaks in there, doesn't it, in that last line of that stanza, that kind of haunting that. But then you have those two images of warmth, hot water bottles, gas in between. It's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, and a beautiful interpretation, Rebecca. Reza, finally.
I found it wonderful. Thanks for reading and sharing this poem with us. To me, good poetry contains pauses and absences that you need to sort of fill up with yourself. You need to put yourself in those absences and pauses, in these gaps. And I think you could see that from the penultimate stanza to the last stanza, that the paradigm, the narrative changes, and you have this realization of the speaker, of the poet. And I can relate to this poem very well as someone who's been sort of dealing with parents who are struggling with terminal illness, and I found it wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reza, and thank you for that lovely insight there. If we can turn now to our next reader, Yuxian. Yuxian, you'll be followed by Joe Hickson, but if you wouldn't mind now introducing yourself and your poem.
Okay, thanks. My name is Yu Tian, who is a third year PhD in electronic engineering, and the poem, can anyone hear me?
Yes,
okay.
I can hear you.
Sorry, the poem I want to introduce was composed by, it's a Chinese poem, which is composed by Du Fu, who, along with Li Bai, are seen as two of the greatest poets of all time in Chinese history. And this poem is considered by many people as the greatest Lü Shi, which is a kind of 8-line regulated verse of all time. And the background of this poem was when Du Fu was having a very hard and vagrant life in his old age, and the then Tang dynasty was starting to go downhill. All these things made Du Fu compose this poem when he had climbed to a very high terrace in a cold autumn day. And can you show the English version of it, Craig? Yeah, thank you. So as the English version is demonstrated, I'm only going to read it in Chinese. Yeah, so 风急天高猿啸哀，渚清沙白鸟飞怀。无边落木萧萧下，不尽长江滚滚来。万里悲秋常作客，百年多病独登台。艰难苦恨繁霜鬓，潦倒新停浊酒杯。Yeah, that's it.
Thanks ever so much, Yuxian, and really interesting to have Chinese verse in its native tongue on our screens tonight. If I could go to Rebecca first, please.
Thank you, Yuxian. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
So I think that what I first noticed was this, the line hating the hardships which have frosted my hair, and just having that quick switch between something internal, something emotional, which is then materializing in physical form, and the kind of the double meaning of that line being both kind of frosting, so therefore cooling, but also aging.
Thanks, Rebecca. If I could go to Reza next.
Yuxian, thank you so much for reading this beautiful poem. I've got to make a comparison here with the tradition that I'm familiar with, and that's Persian poetry. And I feel like, and I could see similarities with English poetry as well, that how the contemplation on nature, or this sort of semblance of nature, the way nature becomes sad and more thoughtful or deeper or grieving with you. So poets using these elements of nature that are sort of mourning for the loss that you're going through, or for the sadness that you're going through. You could see how that is a very sort of imaginative technique that is shared somehow globally. So in China, in Iran, and in Europe. And that would be my observation on the poem.
Thank you, Reza. And finally to Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Yuxian. That was the first time I've heard a poem read in Chinese, and I've really enjoyed it. To me, I thought what struck me was the contrast between, I found the language in this really very sensuous in a way that, as he seems to be almost departing from life and disappearing from life with his ill health and so on. And yet at the same time, you get overwhelmingly that sense of a love for what he's seeing around him, and the incredible detail that he brings to it in a few short lines. I'd agree with Reza about it. It's almost like what the French would call a paysage moralisé, I think, in it's kind of reflecting his internal condition as well. And I must pick up on that final line, sad that illness had made me give up the solace of wine, because that's something that I know that have other people have experienced as they get closer to death, that things just, the sensuous pleasures of life disappear, and it's a great shame. So thank you very much, Yushin.
And thank you, Mike, for that lovely reading of the poem. Thanks, Yushin, for your contribution. If we can move now to Joe Hickson. Joe, you'll be followed by Antonia reading. But Joe, if we could go to you now to introduce your poem.
Oh, thank you. So I'm going to read a very short poem that I wrote. I've just finished an MA in creative writing at Plymouth University, part-time and as a quite a very mature student. And I've just started a PhD at Bristol, so I'm really enjoying kind of getting to know the university at Bristol. But this is a poem I wrote right back at the beginning when I was very new to creative writing. It's called Poetic Insomnia. It's just one of those nights when sleep is just slightly further away than I can reach, just a twist of smoke that my hand passes through, a fall where I can't quite let myself go, a movement out of the corner of my eye that isn't there when I turn my head, a scent I can't quite recall.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for that lovely reading. If we could go to Reza, please.
Joe, thank you so much. I sort of see this poem belonging to this tradition of poets reflecting on poetry, and so I mean, I feel like there maybe a couple of lines. It's like there is the poem. If there was more, I feel like there maybe a couple of lines would have made it more sort of clearer that this is a poem. So the experience that you're going through, and you're sort of framing that within a poem. It itself resembles the experience of poetic creation somehow, that these feelings and these sentiments that you're experiencing. I find it really interesting and wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Reza. If we could go to Mike next.
Yes, thanks, Joe. I almost feel it could have been retitled as just Insomnia as well. In that, I mean, I could so very much, and actually thinking about lockdown that David had alluded to earlier on. I had loads of nights over the last few months where sleep is just slightly further away than I can reach, and then your brain starts thinking about other things as well. And I felt that what you managed to do was to get a sense of the experience of life, of the quickness of life, of the sensuous nature of life, and yet you can't quite grasp it at the same time. And you certainly can't always put it down in words, which was something I think that T.S. Eliot often alluded to. The words just slip and slide away from us. So thank you, Joe. I really enjoyed that.
Thanks, Mike. Again, Rebecca, please.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I need to slightly disagree with Reza, just in terms of I think it's a perfect length. And I also think that it does what I think it's trying to do perfectly, in that if it is a poem about poetry and about writing, and certainly something we've all experienced, that writer's block, where the words are there, but you can't bring them into form. So therefore, to have a poem about poetry that isn't about poetry is truly beautiful, in the sense that the poetry is there, but it's not quite there.
Yeah.
Thanks ever so much, Rebecca. It actually echoes a sense that I had of Freud's uncanny coming through here. This whole poem is almost a very definition of the various aspects of the uncanny. And I think that's because of the bifurcation you speak of between kind of, what's there and what isn't there, and what's being reached for and what can't be touched. So thanks so much, Joe, for that. We appreciate your reading. If we can now turn to Antonia for our next reading, and following Antonia there will be Hilary Frank following Antonia. So thank you, Joe, and over to you, Antonia, to introduce your poem. Sorry, Antonia, we can't hear you. Are you struggling there? Okay, that's fine. We will see. Oh, looks like Antonia's connecting via audio. We'll see if this works. Can we hear you now? Antonia? No, lost Antonia, lost Reza. That's okay. So if Mike, if you wouldn't mind reading, have you got a poem to hand there, Mike?
Yes, I have. Do you mind
Excellent.
if it's another miserable poem? Do you mind that?
I don't mind at all. Whilst we rearrange and see if we can get our readers back together.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a poem by John Donne, one of his sonnets. Death Be Not Proud. Okay. Do you want me to carry on with it, Craig? Yeah.
Yes, please, if you would.
Okay. Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou think'st thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and souls' delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And poppy or charms can make us sleep as well and better than thy stroke. Why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die.
That's a wonderful reading, Mike. Thanks so much. Antonia, are you able to join us now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Antonia, if you go ahead for now, and then Hilary Francato will come to you next. So Antonia, if you'd like to introduce your poem, thank you.
So hello everyone. I'm really sorry about this. So I am doing Paleontology and Evolution in University of Bristol. And I'm going to be reading Totem by Sylvia Plath. So this is one of her few poems that she wrote a couple of days before she died. So it's it very well captures her thoughts and emotions at that time. So here we go. The engine is killing the track. The track is silver. It stretches into the distance. It will be eaten nevertheless. Its running is useless. At night, there is the beauty of drowned fields. Dawn gilds the farmers like pigs, swaying slightly in their thick suits. White towers of Smithfield ahead, fat haunches and blood on their minds. There is no mercy in the glitter of cleavers, the butcher's guillotine that whispers, "How's this, how's this?" In the bull, the hare is aborted, its baby head out of the way, embalmed in spice. Flayed of fur and humanity. Let us eat it like platters after birth. Let us eat it like Christ. These are the people that were important. Their round eyes, their teeth, their grimaces. On a stick that rattles and clicks, a counterfeit snake, shall the hood of the cobra appall me, the loneliness of its eye, the eye of the mountains, through which the sky eternally threads itself. The world is blood-hot and personal. Dawn says, with its blood flush, there is no terminus, only suitcases, out of which the same self unfolds like a suit, bold and shiny, with pockets of wishes, notions and tickets, short circuits and folding mirrors. I'm mad, calls the spider, waving its many arms. And in truth, it's terrible, multiplied in the eyes of the flies. They buzz like blue children in nets of the infinite, roped in at the end by the one, death with its many sticks.
Thanks ever so much, Antonia, for that reading of Plath. If we can go to Rebecca first to comment on that.
Thank you, Antonia. When you introduced the poem and also knowing Plath, I thought to myself, try not to fixate on the death, because it's probably going to be about more than that. However, it's hard not to fixate on the death, because this poem seems very much fixated on it in a way that at times almost seems kind of glorifying it, or certainly kind of relishing in all these different images of death and kind of feeling them out, and kind of trying them on for size, and then putting them aside and picking up a different image of death. And another thing I suppose that struck me is just this kind of sense of nothingness and this desire to kind of take down those big figures. So you've got Plato and then you've got Christ, and there's a kind of warmth in subordination there, I thought.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. I'm going to cut short the panel responses now. So as we're getting towards the end of the evening, so if I can go now to Hilary, Frank to read, but then following that, if possible, Elizabeth Parker. I think I said that I wanted you to send your poem in first, but if you are able to read, I'll call you up next. So if we can go to Hilary, Frank.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm Hilary Frank. I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Bristol, where my research is on 5G wireless communication. The poem I'm about to read is titled Unstoppable Dreams. This poem inspires me. It's my own poem. It inspires me to go on one more mile, one more day, until I succeed, and not to give up in my life's pursuit and dreams. And here is the poem. Unstoppable dreams. No, I refuse to quench. I cannot be put out. Battalions of tortures, brigade of humiliations, regiments of denials. I am unstoppable. Nothing is enough to end my dreams. Too great is my vision, too dim in my mission. I fear no fear. Shining like sun, I come from above. Who then shall I fear? Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Hilary. A wonderful evocation there. If I could go to Reza, please.
Thank you, Hilary. It's a beautiful poem. It's very much Maya Angelou-esque, if I can put it like that. I'm sure I've heard a few poems. I've read a few poems by her that has very similar sort of rhetoric and intention. I also thought that the last two stanzas I could literally think of a very close translation of a Persian poet who says the very similar words, that you come from the sun, so why do you have to stoop, or you have to pursue higher goals? So yeah, that would be my
great. Thanks so much, Reza, and thank you, Hilary. If we can now go to Elizabeth, if that's okay. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Thank you.
Lovely. I've really enjoyed this evening. So thanks to everyone. I'm going to read a poem from my...
I'm really sorry, we seem to have lost Elizabeth there. I'll see if I can get her back. Let's hope, here we go. Sorry, Elizabeth, we lost you there for a second. You're back in now, thank you. If you just take yourself off mute.
Hello?
There we go. Yeah, you're back, thank you, great, sorry.
I'm going to read a poem from my 7 poetry collection, and I'm reading it because probably because of the times we're living in, these experiences have become more intense the further I've moved from them. I've got a 5-month-old baby here, so hopefully we won't be interrupted. Okay, so, and I'm trying not to, I'll hold the book over there. Yeah, as I said, it's a kind of nostalgia and a growing intensity of experiences that are quite far in my past now. That's why I've chosen this. And it's called Woolworths. From those years, I choose waking to find her combing my hair. I choose the Savoy Picture Palace, where we watched foreign films between peach walls, sulky usher in the orchestra pit, vaulted ceiling dripping small chandeliers, plaster medallions framing myths in pale oils, swags so well restored, shadows returned to their precise creases. Beneath glinting crystal, she whispered about her body, her legs too long, lips too big, She wore ballet pumps, waistless shifts, stick-on stars beside her eyes, Liz Taylor lips she would nibble with her front teeth. I choose her white house in the fields, 5 cold stories, her family wearing its damp in their clothes. No telly, just an antique Grundig, easing a dial through static to reach the arches. Rooms bricked up with loved books, leather-bound, softened paperbacks that slopped over your hands. Sleeping over, I'd watch her peel away her lashes, wipe off her iconic mouth. I choose waking to find her combing my hair, gentle tug on my scalp, furrowing of fingers and plastic teeth. I choose apple laces slithered from a pick and mix bag that crackled as she unrolled its neck, sugar sparking on our tongues. I choose Woolworths, its plastic bazaar of sweets, scoops sunk in milk mice, strawberry lips. Thank you.
That's a really wonderful reading, Elizabeth, and I would recommend everyone checking out your collection of poems there that you mentioned. There's the plug for you. I'm going to have no comments from the panel because we're getting close to the hour now. Phoenix, if you can hear me and if that's the right pronunciation, I think we will have you end the session for us with your poem, if that's okay. Can you hear us?
I hear you. Hi, everyone. The poem that I wanted to read was from Langston Hughes, who I'm obsessed with the Harlem Renaissance. So I wanted to give honor to him. He happened to be able to masterfully capture a picture with words. So it's called Dreams. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for when dreams go, life is a barren field frozen with snow.
Thank you so much, Phoenix. That's a lovely way to end on, a lovely note to end on for our final poem of the evening. First, it leaves me to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to the panelists, to the readers, and to the audience.